I knocked. You guys got to pull. Whoa. Wait a minute.
Come on, gang! It's time to go!
That can't be good.
All personnel, it is now 1 minute to zero time. Put on goggles or turn away. Do not remove goggles or face first until 10 seconds after first light.
Oh, that can't be good at all.
Bomba! Она зайдется!
Wait! Stop! Sir, Grace, don't wait for me!
Minus 15 seconds. Minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I had no reason to believe that Mac was a spy.
problem now is future peace. That is your job in Germany. By your conduct and attitude while on guard inside Germany, you can lay the groundwork of a peace that could last forever. Or just the opposite. You could lay the groundwork for a new war to come. And just as American soldiers had to do this job 26 years ago, so other American soldiers, your sons, might have to do it again another 20-odd years from now. Germany today appears to be beaten. Hitler, out. Swastikas, gone. Nazi propaganda, off the air. Concentration camps, empty. You'll see ruins. You'll see flowers. You'll see some mighty pretty scenery. Don't let it fool you. You are in enemy country. Be alert. Suspicious of everyone. Take no chances. You are up against something more than tourist scenery. You are up against German history. It isn't good. This book was written chapter by chapter, not by one man, not by one Führer. It was written by the
Fulton, Missouri, in America's heartland. In March of 1946, Fulton was a sleepy college town of 12,000 people, about to face the biggest day in its history. Only 6 months after the end of World War II, one of the true giants of the 20th century arrived in President Harry Truman's home state.
Truman thought it'd be just wonderful if he brought the great Winston Churchill out to Missouri to make a speech. He loved the idea of bringing the Prime Minister to a small college in the middle of Missouri that nobody ever heard of.
Just a wonderful day to have not only the President of the United States in town, but Winston Churchill, the Lion of England. And so everybody was excited. It was, you know, the atmosphere was charged. It really was.
But Churchill wasn't there to celebrate. He had come to sound an alarm.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Behind that curtain, after the war, the countries of Eastern Europe had been trapped under Soviet domination.
I remember even feeling kind of indignant that the Russians weren't, playing fair, weren't being nice.
Churchill told America there was still a tyrant left in Europe, the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin.
Joseph Stalin was a real son of a bitch. There was a real brutality.
When Stalin heard about Churchill's speech, he called it an act of war.
It was presented as the imminent attack of America on Russia.
The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies in World War II. Now they would turn against each other. The Cold War would last for more than 40 years. Time magazine publisher Henry Luce had predicted that an American century would follow the end of World War II. And by 1946, the world was beginning to witness it. While the map of devastated Europe was redrawn at conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, across the Atlantic, America had emerged from the conflict stronger and more prosperous than ever before. And yet America would be called on again. And in that sense, Churchill's speech was both a warning and an exhortation. If the free world needed a protector from the evils of Stalin, it would have to be the United States of America.
In 1947, the British announced that they could no longer afford to support the pro-Western governments of the Mediterranean in their fight against communism. If the U.S. could not take up the burden, the whole region was in danger of falling under communist rule. The Truman administration responded decisively. On March 12, 1947, the president went before a joint session of Congress to request aid for the countries of Greece and Turkey. The address sent a clear message to the Soviet Union.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
The president's appeal was quickly dubbed the Truman Doctrine. It represented a dramatic change in U.S. foreign policy, but it merely laid the groundwork for what followed. A month later, Secretary of State George C. Marshall traveled to Europe. He witnessed firsthand the physical ruin, social disintegration, and economic collapse left by the war. Marshall warned that under these conditions, Europeans would turn to communism as an alternative to starvation and death. 2 months later, Marshall proposed a program of massive economic assistance, the Marshall Plan.
Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist.
European reaction to Marshall's speech was quick and positive. The British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin hailed it as a lifeline to sinking men. Of all the nations invited to help draft the plan, only the Soviet Union and its satellites refused. The price would be high, up to $17 billion. But compared to the alternative, Marshall told Congress it was a bargain.
This program should be viewed as an investment in peace. In those terms, the cost is low.
While Congress debated the enormous financial commitment, communist-inspired riots led to the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Czechoslovakia. The events galvanized opinion on Capitol Hill, and Congress approved funding for the Marshall Plan. American aid was soon on its way to Europe. Food was distributed, machinery and technical support spurred new production. Homes and businesses were rebuilt. Marshall Plan aid provided nets for Flemish fishermen, money to rebuild Italian automotive factories, construction equipment for France, and coal to fuel Danish industry. The Marshall Plan was an overwhelming success. It launched Western Europe on the road to recovery, beat back the threat of communism in the region, and established the United States as the world's dominant economic superpower. It also contributed to the first major confrontation of the Cold War.
Berlin had lived through a nightmare, and at the end of World War II, the landscape reflected it. The fighting here had been particularly vicious. On the Eastern Front, the Germans had fought to the bitter end. The Soviet army had suffered 500,000 casualties before the German capital fell.
The Russian soldiers, they were intoxicated by blood, by cruelty, and it was with the memories of what Germans did to their mothers and sisters and daughters, they wanted to do the same. There was huge loot, burning down of houses, rape.
Soviet troops raped thousands of women.
My mother was raped, gang raped, by the Russians, and my friend, she was raped. Her father was still alive. They put him in a corner and said, you stand there and you count the rapes on your daughter. So all the 32 Russians raped her. And the father had to count out loud, 1, 2, and so forth. That's why I know it was 32.
The Russians were very brutal. The Germans, they sure hated the Russians, though, and they had a reason. The Russians behaved themselves miserably here.
Several months later, the Western Allies arrived. One of the first U.S. missions into post-war Berlin was flown by Jack Olin Bennett.
So we landed, and then the Russians started to lob shells over my head, shooting the windows out of the airport with artillery shells. Why the hell are the Russians shooting the windows out of this magnificent airport? Then I thought, this is going to be the American sector, and they don't want to leave the Americans anything.
Located deep inside what was now Soviet-controlled East Germany, Berlin would be divided into Soviet, American, British, and French sectors. Stalin resented this democratic outpost in Eastern Europe. This was intended as his buffer zone against any future attack from the West.
Stalin presented his image of the countries on the other side of the Iron Curtain. These countries want to subjugate Russia with its immense mineral wealth. They are natural enemies of the socialist and communist state.
The first face-to-face confrontation of the Cold War was in Berlin. Stalin was determined that the Western Allies should leave, and in June of 1948, he cut all the supply lines into the Allied sectors.
It was very tense, and we knew that, and it got tenser and tenser.
West Berliners had enough food to last a few weeks, enough fuel to last only days.
Truman said in meetings in the Oval Office, and he meant it, we stay in Berlin.
You live with the expectation, I did, that we would be going to war with Russia.
The United States were painted and depicted by official propaganda as the greatest enemy, ready at any hour to drop atomic bomb on Russia.
We were close to a Third World War. There were some who were arguing we should leave. It isn't worth it, get out. Why start a Third World War over this city? Others were saying we should send an armored division through and break through by force.
President Truman chose another option. He would supply the beleaguered city by air. It was a gamble. American and British pilots who had once dropped bombs on this city would deliver supplies to Berlin hour after hour, day after day.
We were so busy during the airlift. I was flying 128 hours a month. It's a lot of flying. And we were keeping people alive.
They flew in food and fuel and medicine. They were the lifeline for 2.5 million Berliners. After 11 months, Stalin conceded. Without saying a word, he ended the blockade in May of 1949. 3 months later, Stalin would shock the West again.
Once we knew the Soviets had the atomic bomb in 1949, it then became, once again, a different world.
November 9th, 2015 marks 26 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It represented not only a physical barrier for the people of Germany, but an ideological divide that split the world in two. Now, what many people don't know about the Berlin Wall is that it didn't run along the border between East and West Germany. Actually, it only encapsulated West Berlin, which was located deep in the heart of East Germany. So what we wanted to know, why was the Berlin Wall built in the first place, and how did West Berlin end up as a political island? Well, to put some of this in perspective, it's important to note the state of Germany just after World War II. The Germans lost the war, ceding the former Nazi power to the victorious Allies. The US, the UK, France, and the USSR carved up Germany. Now, the easternmost portion, running along what was called the Oder-Neisse line, was allocated to Poland to make up for land lost during the war. The rest of the country was split into 4 zones. The Soviet Union took over the zone to the east. The US, the UK, and France occupied their own zones in the western half of the country. And this just left Berlin. Now, technically Berlin was in the Soviet Union's territory, but since Berlin was the capital of Germany, as well as the former home of the Nazi regime, it held significant historical and political value. So, to keep things fair, Berlin was carved up into 4 zones, mirroring the rest of Germany. Now, this arrangement worked briefly. But soon, the USSR began planning to take over the rest of Berlin, then Germany, and then Europe. At the time, the USSR was making a big push to expand socialism throughout its territories, including East Germany. So to accomplish this, the Soviet Union started restricting access to West Berlin, creating one of the first flashpoints of the Cold War, known as the Berlin Blockade. And things only got worse from there. The USSR began restricting emigration from their half of Germany. They built a massive wall known as the Inner German Border, running down the middle of the country with barbed wire, alarms, mines, and thousands of East German soldiers. Now, by many accounts, life in socialist East Germany was pretty abysmal, particularly compared to the democratic and prospering West Germany. Thousands of East Germans defected using a direct subway line between West Berlin and West Germany to bypass that closed border. Now, to put an end to this, the Soviets erected the Berlin Wall in 1961, and it ran nearly 100 miles long. It completely surrounded West Berlin, which may seem counterintuitive because you'd think they'd create a border to protect their own territory. But actually, this wall was to keep their citizens from defecting to the West. The wall would stay in place for nearly 3 decades, and even though this wall was much smaller and less elaborate than the Inner German Border, the Berlin Wall came to symbolize the conflict between socialist and democratic nations. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, marking an end to the USSR's strongholds on East Germany. Now, if you want to learn about what actually brought down the Berlin Wall, check out this video by Seeker Daily up at the top. And to see more of me, check out my video down below, including this one about how robots and avatars can be used to treat depression. Thanks for watching TestTube News. Subscribe below to stay in the loop and watch new videos.
Good evening, and it's great to have you with us here on a very busy Thursday night. And we begin with President Trump front and center, meeting with NATO leaders, some of America's strongest allies. But there was a moment that immediately went viral across the globe. After once calling NATO obsolete during the campaign, President Trump scolding fellow members today for paying too little for defense. But it was this moment that caught the attention of many, when the president seems to push aside the Prime Minister of Montenegro to get to the front. ABC senior White House correspondent Cecilia Vega traveling with the president.
The America First president on the world stage today, making headlines with this moment. President Trump appearing to push aside the Prime Minister of Montenegro to get in front for a photo op. And as for those allies he spent the campaign offending,
NATO is obsolete, it's old, it's fat, it's sloppy.
President Trump later changed his mind, but today, instead of making nice, he's scolded them.
NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations.
He told them the United States spends more on defense than all other NATO countries combined, and now it's time to pay up.
23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States.
Some leaders serious, others whispering to each other. Canada's Justin Trudeau stone-faced.
Was wir in der Vergangenheit erreicht haben.
Germany's Angela Merkel throwing out a subtle jab of her own, saying it is trust, not walls, that unites. President Trump also face-to-face with the new president of France, congratulating Emmanuel Macron, whose far-right opponent many likened to Trump.
Congratulations, great job.
Their handshake seeming to go on and on.
Thank you very much. And Cecilia Vega with us now from Sicily. Cecilia, we know the G7 is next. The president could face some tough questions from other world leaders who don't see eye to eye on some pretty big issues.
Oh, definitely, David. We just touched down here, and this one is not going to be easy for him either. Those world leaders are looking to press President Trump on everything from trade to climate change to America's policy on refugees. David?
Cecilia Vega in Sicily. Cecilia, thank you.
Let's just start with the uncomfortable fact that the American space program would not be what it is today if it weren't for the contributions of a scientist who was a former Nazi. Werner von Braun was an SS officer during World War II and led a team of German scientists in developing the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a military program aided in large part by slave labor at concentration camps. And yet, less than 2 decades later, von Braun was leading a team of NASA scientists in the design and development of the Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that ultimately propelled more than a dozen Apollo astronauts to the moon. Historians still debate whether he was an apolitical scientist who had no choice but to work for Hitler, or a cunning opportunist who knowingly made a deal with the devil to pursue his research. But what we do know is that he was a rocket science prodigy. Upon earning his PhD in physics in 1934 at the age of 22, he joined the German army as a civilian employee. Though younger than most of his colleagues, von Braun led the team that began developing a long-range ballistic missile. Borrowing heavily from the work of an American rocket scientist, Robert Goddard, von Braun's team built a rocket called the A4, later renamed the V2, or Vengeance weapon. The V2 was essentially a larger version of the liquid-fueled rockets built by Goddard, though von Braun made changes to the engines that dramatically increased their power. First, he used alcohol instead of gasoline as the main propellant, along with liquid oxygen. But the real power of his design came from 2 turbopumps, turbines that moved huge volumes of fuel into the combustion chamber at high speeds. These turbopumps could force 58 kilograms of alcohol and 72 kilograms of liquid oxygen into the combustion chamber every second, giving it a thrust thrust of more than 25,000 kilograms, far more than Goddard had achieved. Using this technology, on October 3, 1942, von Braun's creation became the first man-made object to reach the threshold of space, flying to an altitude of 80 kilometers. The missile could travel more than 5,600 kilometers per hour and carry a 1,000-kilogram warhead. As military weapons go, the V-2 was terrifying, but not always accurate. While the Germans launched 5,000 of the missiles toward Western Europe, only about 1,100 actually reached their targets. Still, the V-2 was believed to have killed nearly 3,000 people. Now, there's at least some evidence to suggest that von Braun's sympathy for the Nazi cause only went so deep. For one thing, he was jailed briefly in 1944 after some Nazi spies infiltrated his program and began to suspect that he wasn't loyal enough. But more importantly for science, when the end of the war was in sight, von Braun was ordered to destroy all work related to the V-2. But instead, he hid his documents in an abandoned mine and recovered them shortly before he and his team surrendered to the US Army. As part of a carefully orchestrated mission known as Operation Paperclip, von Braun and his team were sent to the US, where he demonstrated his weapon to the US Army in New Mexico. Later, he was transferred to Huntsville, Alabama, and eventually became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. It was here that von Braun led the team that developed the Saturn V rocket, the most famous of all the rockets. While his V-2 rocket was a pretty nifty piece of machinery, the Saturn V was truly revolutionary. 102 meters tall and at liftoff weighed more than a dozen 747s. And as the world witnessed during the Apollo missions, the Saturn V was not only incredibly powerful, it divided the work of spaceflight into an elegant three-stage system. The first of its three expendable stages produced 3.4 million kilograms of thrust, making it 130 times more powerful than the V-2. It had 5 separate F-1 engines designed by von Braun's team so that the outer 4 engines could move in order to control the direction of the rocket, while the center engine just provided more thrust. After lifting the whole thing to about 68 kilometers, the first stage would separate and the second stage would fire, carrying the spacecraft to the edge of orbit. Once there, the second stage would detach and a third stage pushed the craft into orbit and then toward the moon. Nearly half a century after they were first used, the 5 first-stage engines that were designed by von Braun's team are still the most powerful single-chamber liquid-fueled rockets ever made. As for von Braun, he went on to rise through the ranks of NASA and worked for aerospace companies, eventually being awarded the National Medal of Science not long before his death in 1977. But he never truly escaped his past. Whether you consider him a villain or a visionary or both, there's still no disputing his legacy. Von Braun turned the dreams of early 20th century rocket scientists into reality, and he did it in less than 3 decades. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Space. If you'd like to learn how you can help us keep exploring the universe, you can go to subbable.com/scishow, and don't forget to go to youtube.com/scishow space and subscribe.
On October 4th, 1957, the world watched in awe and fear as the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first man-made satellite, into space. This little metal ball, smaller than 2 feet in diameter, launched a space race between the US and USSR that would last for 18 years and change the world as we know it. Sputnik was actually not the first piece of human technology to enter space. That superlative goes to the V-2 rocket, used by Germany in missile attacks against Allied cities as a last-ditch effort in the final years of World War II. It wasn't very effective, but at the end of the war, both the US and USSR had captured the technology and the scientists that had developed it, and began using them for their own projects. And by August 1957, the Soviets successfully tested the first intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7. The same rocket that would be used to launch Sputnik 2 months later. So the scary thing about Sputnik was not the orbiting ball itself, but the fact that the same technology could be used to launch a nuclear warhead at any city. Not wanting to fall too far behind, President Eisenhower ordered the Navy to speed up its own project and launch a satellite as soon as possible. So on December 6, 1957, excited people across the nation tuned in to watch the live broadcast as the Vanguard TV-3 satellite took off and crashed to the ground 2 seconds later. The Vanguard failure was a huge embarrassment for the United States. Newspapers printed headlines like Flopnik and Kaputnik, and a Soviet delegate at the UN mockingly suggested that the U.S. should receive foreign aid for developing nations. Fortunately, the Army had been working on their own parallel project, the Explorer, which was successfully launched in January 1958. But the U.S. had barely managed to catch up before they were surpassed again, as Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space in April 1961. Almost a year passed, and several more Soviet astronauts completed their missions before Project Mercury succeeded in making John Glenn the first American in orbit in February 1962. By this time, President Kennedy had realized that simply catching up to each Soviet advance a few months later wasn't going to cut it. The U.S. had to do something first. And in May 1961, a month after Gagarin's flight, he announced the goal of putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. They succeeded in this through the Apollo program, with Neil Armstrong taking his famous step on July 20th, 1969. With both countries next turning their attention to orbital space stations, there's no telling how much longer the space race could have gone on. But because of improving relations negotiated by Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev and U.S. President Nixon, the USSR and U.S. moved toward cooperation rather than competition. The successful joint mission known as Apollo-Soyuz, in which an American Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz craft and the two crews met, shook hands, and exchanged gifts, marked the end of the space race in 1975. So, in the end, what was the point of this whole space race? Was it just a massive waste of time? Two major superpowers trying to outdo each other by pursuing symbolic projects that were both dangerous and expensive, using resources that could have been better spent elsewhere? Well, sure, sort of. But the biggest benefits of the space program had nothing to do with one country beating another. During the space race, funding for research and education in general increased dramatically, leading to many advances that may not have otherwise been made. Many NASA technologies developed for space are now widely used in civilian life, from memory foam in mattresses, to freeze-dried food, to LEDs in cancer treatment. And of course, the satellites that we rely on for our GPS and mobile phone signals would not have been there without the space program. All of which goes to show that the rewards of scientific research and advancement are often far more vast than even the people pursuing them can imagine.
The United States would suffer another shock when, on October the 1st, 1949, they learned that Mao Zedong's communists had defeated the American-backed nationalist forces in China.
The communists under Mao touched something very deep in the peasantry, fought a brilliant fight. You have the Russians getting the atomic weapon, China has fallen. There's no doubt that there was a sense in many quarters that we were in a titanic struggle.
The struggle erupted on June the 25th, 1950, when North Korea, supported by both the Soviet Union and China, attacked the South. An American-led army under the auspices of the newly formed United Nations was rushed in to resist them.
Free nations have now made it clear that lawless aggression will be met with force.
So once again, a wartime draft interrupted American lives. Men were torn from their families and sent to the other side of the world. World War II vet Len Maffioli had been enjoying the sun-baked California good life. By November of 1950, he was fighting North Korean and Communist Chinese soldiers at Korea's Chosin Reservoir.
The Chinese were all over us. We just mowed them down. And it was just hard to believe that they would just keep coming like that. And we had an awful lot of dead and dying. It dropped between 20 and 40 degrees below zero at times. It got so cold, the tank treads froze to the ground. I don't think anyone bled to death. The blood froze as soon as it hit the surface. But we strictly weren't prepared for that bitter a winter.
Here we were just out of a war about 5 years, and we're starting over again in another one. Flew all my Marine missions in support of the troops, close air support along the front lines, napalm, close support with bombs, rockets. In 3 years' time, we lost 53,000 Americans out there. It was called a police action, of course, but it was, for those involved, it was a bloody, bloody war.
The fighting in the Korean War was as ferocious as any seen in World War II. But when the veterans came home, the reception they got was quite different.
In Korea, you went for 12 or 13 months. And at the end of your tour, you were sent home. There were no bands to meet them, no parades or anything like this. The way the American people treated the Korean War and the returning veterans, I think it could be termed the Forgotten War.
I think most Americans did not see the Korean War as a personal threat to themselves and their families. Would it affect the person in the Midwest someplace in their home and their children? No, it probably would have very little impact on them. So I don't think most Americans saw it as being as important as World War II had certainly been, and so they didn't pay that much attention to it.
By 1951, the war in Korea had become a bloody stalemate. The commander of the UN forces, the imperious World War II hero General Douglas MacArthur, virtually demanded a free hand to go after the Chinese.
MacArthur's supposed to have wanted to have used 50 atomic bombs against Korea, North Korea, and China, and to lay down a permanent radioactive belt along the Yalu River.
But President Truman would not use the bomb again, and after MacArthur criticized the president and lobbied on to expand the war into China, Truman terminated the general's command and fired him for insubordination. On April the 20th, 1951, MacArthur addressed a joint session of Congress.
I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
MacArthur's credo of total victory had been rendered obsolete by the new technology of mutual terror. Total victory now might mean total annihilation. In November of 1952, America tested the hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima. To develop the hydrogen bomb, scientists created a new and highly advanced calculator. They named it the Mathematical Analyzer, Numerical Integrator, and Computer. They called it by its acronym, MANIAC.
It's only for your protection, so just want to make sure you guys are safe.
So we're going here onto the actual line to go into North Korea, and I actually have to walk this way. We can't shoot left, we can't shoot right, we can only shoot forward. There's a lot of restrictions on our cameras, but to get here we had to go through 3 checkpoints. We passed some anti-tank explosives, and now we're about to go into these blue rooms and into the North Korean line. So the North Koreans and the South Koreans still meet in this room?
Yes, the last known visit was 2008.
Literally, these microphones on the table are what defines the line. So North Korea on this side, South Korea on that side. It seems so easy, it's just one step. But when you think about all of the militarization and what you go through and the barbed wire, it's certainly far from easy. This concrete slab is literally the border. We're shooting it from the northern side, 17 inches by 5 inches, concrete. That's it. That marks the border. It's been here since 1953. And now the way that they pass messages, it's pretty amazing. They don't use email. They don't actually even use a phone. There's a phone, but it rings and rings. The North Koreans don't answer it. They actually, by bullhorn, communicate to the North Koreans. When we were inside the building, we could walk onto the North Korean side of it. But if I were to do that outside the building, to actually step over that line here, what would happen to me?
What would happen is all these soldiers here would make an attempt to stop you, especially me. And once you get over there, we can no longer help you.
What would the North Koreans do?
Probably run down there and grab you.
For the South Korean soldiers, this is the most prestigious assignment there is. To serve here in the DMZ, they have to be at least 5 feet 9 inches tall, which is taller than average, and every single one of them has a black belt in Taekwondo. So North Korean and South Korean soldiers stand here every single day and stare at each other. The South Korean soldiers are right behind me, and then you can see that concrete building. That's where North Korean tourists can come to visit the DMZ, and apparently a lot of Chinese actually come through the North Korean side as well. And then there's that soldier. He stands there every single day, but the South Koreans and the Americans don't know his name, so they just refer to him as Bob. So we're basically surrounded by North Korea now, right?
Yes. Give you a little idea of that. All this tree line and around that road and back is all North Korea.
So it's all North Korea, and where we are is sort of one little safe spot, but this is all mined as well, right?
Yes. There's approximately, I'm assuming, 1,000 mines within this area alone.
Amidst the minefields is a bridge, and North Korea is on the other side. There's actually a cement wall to prevent defectors from coming over to the south. It's called the Bridge of No Return, and 62 years after the ceasefire, it's still a lonely place.
Domino theory has very little to do with dominoes, and even less to do with pizza. Instead, it deals with the spread of communism throughout the world. It was said that if one nation adopted communism, so too would nearby nations, one after the other after the other. While he never trademarked the term domino theory, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first person to use the analogy during a 1954 news conference. In a time when communism was seen in much of the West as an immense evil, the idea of country after country falling to the communists was terrifying to many Americans. Most fears centered around Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, and domino theory provided a convenient reason for the United States to get involved in police actions in the region to prevent the spread of communism. Although maybe it'd be better if we solved our problems over a real game of dominoes instead.
Getting elected president is an expensive business. Campaign costs add up. There are advertisements to make, travel expenses, convention costs, even bumper stickers. But where does all this money come from?